Hello and welcome to In Good Faith, a podcast produced by the Baha'i Office of Public Affairs here in the UK. I'm Sophie, and alongside my colleague and friend Carmel, we'll be hosting this series of podcasts. At the Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, we follow national conversations on topics that shape the way we interact and progress as a society, learning alongside others and offering our thoughts and insights, inspired by and rooted in the Baha'i teachings. At our office, we follow the discourse on the role of religion in society, social cohesion and how it's built, and the role of the media in society. As part of the discourse on the media, we explore the relationship between religion and the media in particular. This first episode of our podcast, recorded a few weeks ago, is an example of the kinds of conversations we're privileged enough to facilitate, participate in, and listen to during our work. We're joined today by Rizwana, Director at the Centre for Media Monitoring and the Muslim Council of Britain. She has over 30 years of experience working with the media, and as a producer and director, Rizwana's work has won awards, been used as evidence in inquiries, and even impacted policy. We're also joined by Rosie Dawson. Rosie is currently a freelance journalist, documentary maker, and radio producer who has had over 25 years of experience working in the BBC. She's won a number of industry awards. She specialises in religion and ethics coverage. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us on this busy Thursday morning. We thought it might be quite useful just to build kind of a vision of the current landscape of religion together in the media world. How is it that you see it, Rizwana, obviously, from the years you've spent at the Muslim Council of Britain Centre for Media Monitoring? What do you think about the way that religion is represented? And then Rosie, maybe from your experience as a jobbing journalist, what do you think about the way that religion is represented in the media?
I mean, I would say that religion is represented as, I think, backward, conservative, illiberal, restrictive, and source of conflict and violence. That's the kind of general paradigm. And then when it comes to Muslims and Islam, and that's because we obviously focus on monitoring the media on how Muslims and Islam are reported, I think it's the religion and its followers are probably the most misunderstood in the media, and I think it's problematic because Islam and Muslims are generally reported on within conflict paradigms and portrayed as the other or to be feared, and we just have a plethora of kind of far-right tropes that permeate mainstream media from, Islam is a threat to the West, Islam is monolithic, it's inherently violent, Muslims are barbaric, and that the religion itself, which has billions of followers, is kind of monolithic, that it's intolerant of other religions, it's inherently anti-Semitic, oppressive to women. So, I mean, these are the tropes that come out, and they're borne out by kind of statistics which show how the British public perceives Muslims and Islam. So, the role that the media has is really, really important. And it's unfortunate that what we have found is that generally there is a lot of misrepresentation, I would say, and not a very good track record for the media, especially when it comes to Muslims and Islam. But generally, I think religion is not well reported in the media. It's still sidelined. It's a niche kind of market where, you have specific programming. And that to me is kind of quite astonishing when, 80% of the world's population associates with a faith or a belief. And so this is mainstream. It shouldn't be marginalized.
Rosie, you're obviously working in media yourself, and it's something that you deal with every day. How would you paint a picture of religion?
I think it would be a very different picture from the one Rizwana has painted, but I do agree with her that the representation of Muslims and Islam in the media is particularly problematic. I mean, it's I think that Muslims receive a far poorer press than other faith groups. I think some other faith groups are ignored, and I think others are just presented in a more diverse way. I would want to say there's some very good reporting and programming. And I think I'd want to make a distinction. I think so much depends on the outlet. I think so much depends on the genre. I mean, I think with news, there's one issue. With features, I think you're much more likely to get sympathetic and engrossing engagement with faith. And I mean, I suppose I speak particularly as a former BBC producer, where I think there was a good deal of good programming. I mean, I'd have to say that because I made a lot of it, reflecting the beliefs and practices of many different faiths. So I actually would also probably make a distinction between broadcast and print. I think it's a very mixed picture, and in some ways, I think it's getting better. I think what the growth of non-Christian faith communities in this country has done is to raise the profile and visibility of religion and to say this matters in people's lives. It's not something that can be ignored. And I think that's been a very positive thing.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was thinking just to bring Carmel in, who's joined us from the Baha'i Office of Public Affairs as well. We were thinking about this question earlier, and we were talking about the way that religion's represented at the local level is actually also different to the way it's represented at the national level. And I can see you nodding, which I like. Good to build that consensus. But the positive impact of faith in local papers gets a lot more coverage. But particularly it seems to be, and I agree, I think, with Rosie, that it's definitely in news where you have this representation of religion that's in response to crisis always. And that's what I think we see with a lot of the coverage of Islam, is that it's always in response to something bad that's happened because of the mechanics of news.
Well, I think that it is the nature of news, isn't it? Is that you report on the crisis and the problems and the things that are not normal. The problem is when that's then taken as normal. The exception to that, of course, is when you get a tragedy like Grenfell and it's not necessarily even commented on, but there's the response, and there are the people pouring onto the streets to help and to deliver food and to collect stuff. And I mean, the floods is another example. And you see people who are visibly religious. You see, you see clergy in their collars, and you see Sikhs with their turbans, and you see women in hijabs, and you just see that these are religious communities coming together to respond to human need. And I think you see that almost without it being remarked on. You notice it.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I think news is, a beast in itself, and so the kind of response to stories is, reactive by nature. Sometimes there's kind of more in-depth, investigative, feature-length stuff, but generally it's reactive. And it's also, its aim is to kind of simplify things, to make it digestible for the audiences. And so, some of the nuances may not be looked into. But I would say that as far as news is concerned, if you look at COVID, it was quite interesting that there was quite a lot of coverage on what faith communities were doing in response to COVID, and from a very positive perspective, which you don't normally find. And it raised the profile of religious communities, and also the concept of, charity and giving and helping your neighbour. So I think that was quite positive as far as news was concerned.
Thanks both. And I think, that we've kind of built a bigger picture about what this landscape looks like of religion and in the media, and how it's kind of evolving and will continue to evolve. And I guess that kind of takes us to our next question about the impact of this. What does this impact have on people's perception of religion and belief, and also on wider society?
I suppose one of my questions back would be, where are most people getting their information or biases or perceptions of religion from? And it's mediated, but I mean, to what extent are they getting them from mainstream media now, and what's the role of online? And that's a whole other area. that should concern us, I think. You'll know much more about the media monitoring side of things, Rizwana, about where audience, how this impacts the audience.
Okay, when it comes to Muslims and Islam, there's a body of evidence there from studies that have been done at Cambridge University, Leicester University, that specifically say that the media's coverage of Muslims and Islam is contributing to rising hostility towards these. And the most worrying is that 35% of children agreed or partly agreed that Muslims are taking over Britain. So now, not all of this can be apportioned to, the media's coverage of Muslims and Islam. But, if you take that what most people get is from the media, then the media has a role in this. So the impact is, I think, first and foremost, is on hate crimes, both physical and verbal, towards Muslims themselves. Secondly, on perceptions within, the larger community. And then thirdly, around social cohesion. It creates divisions, it creates the other, it creates enemies, and it moves away from the nuanced sides of all of us, irrespective of what religion we belong to. I think the impact is quite strong and quite dangerous. So, the kind of accountability and the responsibility that lays on the shoulders of journalists is huge.
I think it's really interesting. But I mean, if you live in a predominantly white area, then you don't have those daily encounters with Muslims to to help you assess the validity of claims like that. And that that's would be quite interesting to know is the different reception to tropes like that depending on where people live.
What's interesting for the media is how they love certain gatekeepers. There needs to be a lot more honesty and openness within the media to kind of allow different voices that have different views to be able to, put those views. Because I think we've gone into a kind of a binary society, haven't we? We've gone into black and white. It's kind of you're either this or you're that. You're for it or you're against it. And the nuances in the middle, that kind of the commonalities that exist amongst humans, irrespective of your background, of your gender, of your race, of your religion, that's what's missed. And when we look at ourselves, generally most people have the same hopes and fears. They're kind of concerned about their family, about their kids' schooling, about, the NHS, about what kind of government policies are impacting on them. And yes, faith influences how we see things, but we're more than just that. And I think that's what's lost, is that people are not just seen as, first and foremost, human beings with very shared experiences.
Yeah, I think this is something I also wanted to pick up on, Rizwana, that you mentioned before about social cohesion. And I'm just wondering whether the way we engage with religion, that it's something that's very visual, that it's something that I can tell by the way someone looks or dresses or eats. Is that an issue within the media? Is that something that needs to be overcome? Are we perceiving it as something that's to be seen rather than maybe those kind of underlying principles? Are we engaging with those at all?
I mean, I think, again, it comes down to, the media having to kind of present things, or not the media in general, but, if you look at visual language, you have to very quickly identify people. And so those kind of overt symbols of, the minaret or the church spire or, the dog collar or the hijab or whatever, those are kind of visual languages to kind of identify who somebody is and what faith they belong to. But there is a tendency to kind of report on faith through the rituals only. And so that is what people come away with, that, religions are just a set of kind of rituals, whereas, there's a lot more to religion than that. And I think we would know that, the concepts of truth, justice, charity, tolerance, social responsibility, treating yourself, treating others as you would treat yourself. I mean, concepts like that are not kind of associated with religions because religions aren't reported on in that way. I think we need to get away from just seeing religion as a set of rules and rituals. Stop seeing it within the kind of paradigm of just conflict, and really look to the essence and the spirituality of what religions are about, and how followers practice their faith in everyday life, and and not just in terms of rituals.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just wondering, Rosie, as someone that's kind of been dealing with this element of representation, what you would think about that as well. Because I'm just thinking also, even from the Baha'i perspective, it's not so obvious that someone is a Baha'i. I think it's something that it's baked into a set of kind of values and principles, and maybe it's harder to engage with those just because of the format that we have media. We have a very visual culture as well. But yeah, I don't know whether that's something that you've kind of come across, Rosie, and have thoughts on.
I'm not sure I've got much to say on the visual side of things. I am an audio producer after all. But I'm interested in what Rizwana is saying about the reducing of religion sometimes to rituals, and certainly seeing it through a conflict paradigm. And I think that the importance of reflecting just religion as it is lived is really, really important. At the same time, we have to confront the problems where they arise, and we have to hold religion and their communities to account, so that where conflict or behaviours arise because of a particular interpretation of text, for instance, that needs to be interrogated. I find it difficult when people actually reduce religion to a set of beliefs, because I don't think that's what religion is. But we do also need to ask, what are the beliefs that are informing this particular behaviour, and where do those beliefs arise from, and what's the relationship between the belief and the text? And I think the most important, or one of the most important jobs religious journalism can do, is to show that texts which might appear or which are problematic can be read in a variety of ways. They don't lead to one interpretation. But for some people, they lead to very damaging and violent interpretations. And I think it's just a question of explaining that. At the end, what I'm saying is that journalists can't afford to ignore religion, because, as Rizwana is saying, 80% of the population in the world, affiliate themselves to a religion, and how they understand it really matters to the way we live in our communities and the future of the world.
Definitely, and I think it's really interesting to hear as well this aspect of religion that maybe goes under the surface in the media because of what was kind of highlighted before, in the way that's operated and maybe is reactive. But we can also see that religion can also be a body of knowledge, and that encompasses belief, that encompasses the material aspects, the physical, the outward expression of religion, as much as it does the inner, the spiritual kind of dimension. And we see these two go hand in hand in a way, thinking about these assumptions that we see about religion, how can also often be almost pitted against each other because of not accepting the material elements or the spiritual contribution that religion brings, which maybe is what also helps to see it as not being important in a sort of secular society. So then maybe Rizwana, if you also had other thoughts, but then we could also go to think about what is then this truer representation of religion and belief, because we've seen how, Rosie, as you're highlighting, how it has been a source of division and strife, and how that has come from internally as well as externally in religious communities, from perhaps lack of understanding of the text and strong differing opinions.
I think it's about normalization, isn't it? About sometimes, especially when it comes to the media, allowing people who belong to a faith to be engaged on issues that go beyond what their perceived perceptions would be of what faith represents, and what they should be kind of interested in or talk about or whatever. So I think we should see a lot more kind of faith-based perspectives on issues ranging from politics to economics to climate change to poverty to, healthcare or whatever. And it's not to say that, the faith has to be kind of explained in terms of its views on those, but there are different perspectives, and those perspectives and those opinions and kind of varied views should just be normalized on mainstream media. We just need to see people who belong to faiths being seen, not just on programming about faith, but on mainstream, I would say, in inverted commas, mainstream issues.
Rose, what would you think is a truer representation of religion and belief? Because we acknowledge that I think that it can't be ignored, but that it's also not this kind of other thing to be engaged with only in, as Rizwana was saying, only when we're dealing with religion stories, because it impacts all sorts of kind of the ways that people interact with one another. I don't know what you think would maybe be a truer representation or a fairer or more constructive way of engaging with religion.
Well, I'm having a problem with the word truer. A sort of more rounded representation of religion would be one where I guess the issue is that you wouldn't necessarily see it. I mean, the people who are active in public life or on football pitches. I mean, it's interesting that something we're reading a bit this week about the Christian faith of the three, Rashford, Saka and Sancho. But, the faith just is part of people's lives. So they don't necessarily put their hand up and say, I'm doing this because I'm a Christian or because I'm a Muslim. And therefore, and you don't necessarily want people to do that. It's just part of who they are. And they don't feel the need to sort of shout about it. I suppose, what might be refreshing would be, is when you get a couple of people on Love Island who practice a faith but aren't there to shout about it and aren't picked because they're prudes or or fit the stereotype of what a religious Christian or Muslim or whatever is, but they are just there and that is part of who they are. So the sort of programming that shows people in their everyday lives as who they are, in which as part of their day you might see them kneeling on a prayer mat or lighting a candle in front of a shrine, but it's almost that you don't comment on it. But here we're not, we're talking about, again, we're not talking about news programming here necessarily, are we? We're talking about sort of general media representations in sort of featured lives of people. That's what I think gives a more rounded, would give a more rounded view. But I suppose in order to get a more rounded view, then there needs to be a restraint on the sensationalist news reporting, which sees things in a very sort of black and white way, or takes a particular sort of, has a particular beef or particular line to peddle. I mean, and probably in order to get a more rounded representation of religion generally, that is the most important change that could happen, I would imagine.
And I think it's about taking the stigma away from religion and belonging to a religion. I remember speaking to colleagues at the BBC, and there was a kind of like just an informal poll that was done, and a lot of people practice a faith and believe, but would not say it openly for fear of kind of being labelled X, Y, and Z. Because I think there is, we live in a secular society. There are perceptions about religion and what that means. And so there is a kind of a stigma when you kind of show yourself as belonging to a faith, because you're immediately, put into a kind of a category, and you must therefore, be this, that, or the other. So I think that the stigma of having a faith needs to be kind of stripped away. As Rosie says, that, people don't necessarily put their hands up to say, I'm doing this because I am this and therefore it means this. It just is. We just are. And, we should just be reported in that way as well.
There's something about the culture of the newsroom, isn't there? I mean, I started my broadcasting career at Radio Merseyside, and that was a really interesting place because there was a complete acceptance there that religion was part of life, because Liverpool was a very religious city. It was a long time ago, but it was a time when the Catholic Archbishop of Liverpool and the Anglican Bishop of Liverpool was sort of a sort of kind of double act, and it was just after Hillsborough, and you wouldn't diss religion in the newsroom any more than you diss football, to be honest. And a lot of my colleagues were quietly going to mass but not talking about it, and then the assumption and maybe that the culture of other newsrooms are perhaps more secular, that perhaps that's a religious story, so you do it, you rather than that's a religious story and any of us can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just wondering also, do we think that we've lost that acknowledgement that religion is a part of public life? Is that something that's kind of fallen out because we've moved towards maybe a more secular society, but there is still faith, there is still religion, and though in Merseyside at the time and Liverpool was a religious city and kind of everyone knew that there was some acknowledgement of faith, do we think we've lost that acknowledgement in some way, and how do we build that back up again? And then just to pile the questions on while we're here, I'm just wondering as well, Rosie, you mentioned that kind of like more rounded vision of religion so people can make their own decisions. But I'm just wondering, if we did have that more rounded vision of religion, whichever faith belief it might be, what do we think would come out of that?
But I think there is more acknowledgement that religion matters to large proportion of the population.
I'd agree with Rosie on that. I think that there was a kind of a phase of some decades where it had kind of gone out of favor, but now there is that acknowledgement, and I think it's discussed a lot more. I think it kind of permeates mainstream media a lot more, and I think the acknowledgement is certainly there and recognized, that it is important not only to those who follow a faith, but I think to society in general, and an acknowledgement that a lot of kind of, whether people go to church or go to mosque or go to synagogue or go to a temple or whatever, that doesn't encapsulate whether somebody's religious or not, and that vast majority of people, the values that we have emanate from religious thought. And so along there, there's a lot of commonality in terms of values that people share, that emanate from faith.
Yeah, and there's a really nice quote from the Baha'i writings where Baha'u'llah, who's the founder of the Baha'i, where he says that religion should be the chief instrument for the establishment of order in the world and of tranquility amongst its peoples, and that the way it can do this is by effecting a transformation in the whole character of mankind that manifests itself outwardly and inwardly, that affects, our inner life, but also our external conditions. And I think this idea or perception that religion can also be a tool for fostering unity, that can be a tool that allows humanity to have this sort of selfless love for one another, that we can find its expression in elements of our life, in our social lives, financial, economic, spiritual, material, and in education, all these dimensions of our lives. They can kind of find that expression, and I think in that way we also see that in the same way, Rosie was sharing about science, that, this harmony of science and religion, for example, to see them both as two bodies of knowledge. How do they both contribute to bringing about the betterment of our world. Sometimes we just limit the purpose of something to just the here and the now, but really if we're able to see the longevity of the contribution of different bodies of knowledge in advancing our civilization and saying we want to see a better world for the future generation, we want to see a better world now as well. And what does it mean to tap into the task of religion, and also those who have different beliefs as well? What does it mean to work together in unity to bring about peace?
Yeah, this actually kind of taps into the second question I garbled at Rosie, was about when you see a more rounded media and more rounded representation of religion, what is it that we think we'll get out of that? What do we think will become evident? And I wonder whether it does tap into a bit of what Carmel's saying there, is that you can see those greater kind of commonalities between faiths rather than them being these kind of competing traditions or bodies of knowledge.
I mean, I think it's going back to, it is the commonality, it is the kind of, the more positive aspects of religion as opposed to the negatives that are normally latched onto. And like I've mentioned before, the kind of essences of what religions represent, whether it's kind of truth, justice, peace, love, charity, responsibility, to show how those actually manifest themselves in society and how we're influenced by those and how they are not only good but very positive forces. And that religion can contribute to society. Religion can contribute to kind of national discourses. Religion doesn't have to be retrogressive or backward or kind of, something of days gone by. It is very present. It is very current. It can offer perspectives on various issues. It can bring about cohesion. It is kind of very much involved in, acts of charity and voluntary work and working with communities on the ground. And it's contributing, it's contributing on every single level of society, whether we acknowledge it or not.
I sometimes think, why do I care so much about religious journalism? And I'm not even sure that I want to say, well, we need a more positive representation of religion. I mean, I think we do. I think the positive side needs to be told. But the only words I come up with in the end is that it matters. It matters that religion is reported properly. If religion is, and interpretations of religion are wreaking havoc in the world, we report on it and we explain it. And all we can, and we say that this is happening, but we don't leave it there. That's not the only story that's happening. I mean, one thing that I think the media should be better at is addressing the varieties and the complexities within a particular faith. So, and this is the danger, isn't it? That all Muslims think this or all Christians think that. Well, actually, no, they don't. The variety and the divisions within religions are as important to report as the variety and divisions between religions.
I was just going to add, in terms of when it's about proportionality as well, because if you only focus on the contentious, on the negative, on the divisions, on you then kind of perpetuate a certain narrative. So I think there's got to be a balance between the two, and you've got to look at the nuances, and you've got to give the context, and you've got to kind of present it, I think, within the context. But proportionality, because often what we find is that we do just tend to kind of latch on to the negative stories surrounding religions, and it's not that you have to then balance it, like Rosie says, with kind of positive, but be consistent. Then don't just pick and choose one aspect and ignore the rest.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights the responsibility in both religious communities and in journalists, media practitioners, to both really be kind of putting this work into building a stronger understanding together so that society can also move forward and be enriched for both constructively building ourselves stronger and better, and also reinforcing the diversity that makes a society something strong and what it is. And we've seen how, so we were mentioning earlier the coverage of different religious communities, and we've seen the way that it is open and inclusive to all. And like was shared earlier as well, it's not necessarily something that one owns their religion, but rather it's something that just enforces, the way that one sees the purpose of their lives. And I was just thinking of an example in one of different communities around the world, that the way that, for example, the Baha'i community is engaged in community building activities like many other organizations and religious communities, but that is quite unique in the sense that we see children coming together and thinking about, how do I strengthen my spiritual qualities, and how do I strengthen the bonds of friendship at the level of our community? And that it doesn't matter what religion one belongs to, or whether one belongs to it or not, that children have this innate desire to develop these capacities that they have. And as a community as well, how do we create this environment where not just for children, but for all kind of generations in society, that it doesn't matter if we belong to a particular organization or religion, or what does it mean for our behaviors, for our actions? Because at the end of the day, that's what we see makes a transformation in our sort of communities. And I guess to that point, maybe it's useful to just think, as religious communities, what can religious communities do to improve their relationship with the media as well? If we have any thoughts, and then we'll think conversely, what could the media do to improve their relationships with religious communities?
I think the bottom line is respect, isn't it, from either side? It's kind of, from the media's point of view, it's a question of respecting religious communities from kind of a community perspective. I think there's a lack of trust actually within communities, especially within Muslim communities. There's a huge lack of trust when it comes to the media, predominantly because of the way in which communities have been reported on. And so there, I think the onus does rest on the media to build up that trust, to start engaging with communities, but communities also need to kind of open themselves up to engage with journalists, and not to see all journalists as being out to get them. So it's a bit of give and take from both sides, I think. I think there needs to be a lot more kind of research and outreach on the part of journalists, because often you hear when it comes to religion, oh gosh, either people haven't done their due diligence in terms of researching the subject matter, just as they would research any other subject matter. That's the basic kind of tenet of journalism, is you research, you get the facts, you understand, and you speak to people. So I think, research and outreach, so gaining a bit more knowledge of not only the religion, but the people who follow it, and then just going out there and meeting people and talking to people and understanding. I think diversity within newsrooms is a must. People who belong to different faiths and different backgrounds to kind of, not only shed light and give different perspectives, but kind of, have kind of a stake in the output as well. But then I think there's also a need for a cultural change within newsrooms and media establishments as well, in terms of just being able to accept people of other faiths and backgrounds. Training is really important. I know unconscious bias training is not kind of a word that's used now, but we all have unconscious bias. We all have prejudices. We all have, misconceptions. And I think there's a lot of that amongst journalists regarding faith and religion. And so I think training is really important. And on the part of communities, I think it's about us also kind of having spokespeople or people who can kind of translate and their perspectives, but also be eloquent spokespeople or who are also knowledgeable. And we need to put forward, whether it's scholars or whether it's community organizations or whether it's just, expertise in various areas of, genetics or astrology or, science or whatever. It's to have people also put themselves forward. And for the media to kind of use this pool of expertise that's out there that comes, from different religious backgrounds.
Only a couple of things to either underline what Rizwana has said or to add. I mean, in the sense of what religious communities could do to improve their relationship with the media, to try not to be defensive. I mean, when you've been burned, it's really hard not to be. To understand the differences between the different media. That there are journalists you can trust and there are journalists you can't. So foster relationships with those that you can trust, and maybe encourage vocations in journalism. Encourage young people in religious communities to enter journalism and to see it as a honourable profession. So that's on that side. The other thing, of course, is local journalism. You can't build a relationship. I mean, you can do a lot with Zoom, can't you? You can do a lot with phone calls. I'm constantly speaking to people that I've never actually seen face to face, but nothing beats that face to face contact and the sort of intimate knowledge that local journalists will have of their turf. And the problem is that local journalism is just sort of in free fall. It's and that's a really serious problem. So that if they don't learn their tools of their trade there and they move into national newsrooms and they've never worked in the local paper or on local radio, then I think they've lost some essential training, really. And I think the other question for journalists is maybe just to, when you're looking at your story, I mean, I hope that your journalists are thinking, who haven't I heard from, or who else might have something to say about this story? But also, actually, is there a religious element to this story? Because I think one of the problems you've got is that there are religious stories, and that's when the Archbishop of Canterbury does something. But actually, there are other stories which are about health and education and all sorts of things where religion, it might not be the focus, but it's present in the story, and that's why it's not good enough to leave religious journalism to the religion specialists, because it needs to be spotted in those other stories as well. So I think almost an audit of journalists to say, right, who haven't I spoken to? What's here that I haven't seen? Is there a religion element? That would help.
Just to add on to what Rosie was saying in terms of the onus on the community, I mean, from our work at the Centre for Media Monitoring, we do kind of see the onus not just being on the media, but the community itself. And so there's a number of things that we're doing. We regularly hold kind of meet the media events where we bring together community organisations with journalists, editors, etc. And it's as much a kind of a time for both sides to kind of get to know each other, build those bridges in terms of trust, but it is a networking kind of session as well. So that the media know, okay, that person does this, they would be good to bring on if we're talking about X, Y, and Z. So I think there needs to be a lot more of that. And in terms of kind of encouraging more young people, we are going to be running a mentoring scheme for young Muslims who want to become journalists. So we're teaming them up with Muslims in mainstream media, so that they've got a level of support, there already. But I think it's about, it is a great profession, and we've kind of knocked it a lot today, but it's still, for me, one of the greatest professions to be in. It's, you can do amazing things.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it. Just to say that we kind of started by sketching out what we think the media landscape looks like. We said it's actually a bit of a mixed bag, depending on where you look. And then Rosie raised this question of, well, where is it that people are getting their perceptions about religion and the media? Because is it just online? Is it in print? Is it broadcast? And then we were talking about the way that we represent religion, how we can make sure it's both this material and spiritual thing, that we engage with the problems and also the better elements of it, the more constructive elements of it. And we spoke a little bit about like what a more rounded vision of religion might look like, and maybe what the purpose of religion is. And then also the fact that, you know, either way, no matter how you look at it, the representation and the reporting of religion matters, because it impacts huge numbers of people in their lives. And then we kind of spoke about some of the solutions we might have. So it was this kind of growth of trust and diversity, that communities go into journalism, religious communities kind of seek that out as a career path. And then also, I thought this was a really lovely point from Rosie at the end, that these stories on health and education, like there are blind spots that we're not looking at, where religion is a significant portion of that. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. We hope that you found it a constructive conversation. We definitely have. Thank you to those who joined us, and to you for listening. Keep an ear out for more podcasts, continuing to follow these profound topics in the weeks to come.